So let's go into joints now. So joints are classified in three different ways. Let's see, three different types of joints are classified. I'm sorry, joints can be classified in one of three ways. And I want you to keep this word in mind, classified, because part of the confusion around what we study is that we classify things in more than one way. So muscle cells, for example, are classified by morphology. That's like how the tissues are formed. And they're classified based on their function, like are they voluntary or involuntary? And then they're classified to be, three types. I would say by type, like whether it's skeletal, cardiac, or smooth. And just knowing those three classifications are there can help to prevent a lot of confusion, because it's easy to mix up, for example, a cardiac type of muscle with an involuntary versus voluntary function of muscle versus a striated or non-striated morphology of a muscle. Okay, so with joints, there's also multiple systems that they classify by. Okay, one is the type of the way that the joints join. So it can be synarthrotic. I put these terms here: synarthrodial, synarthrotic, and synarthrosis, so that you realize that that it's really this first part of each word that gives away the nature of the joint. So synarthrosis or synarthrodial is two bones which have joined and are practically one. There's almost no movement in a synarthrosis joint, synarthrodial joint, right? And these are made up of fibrous tissue that join two bones, a joint joined by fibrous connective tissue. There's, generally speaking, like no cartilage, synovial type stuff between these joints. They're not meant to move, and they're meant to provide, if they provide any movement at all, it's marginal. They're also called fixed joints, right? And then there's amphiarthrotic, amphiarthrodial, amphiarthrosis joints. Those joints have cartilage between them, but they also have fibers, connective tissue fibers connecting them. And so they are slightly movable. And then diarthrotic, diarthrosis, diarthrodial, diarthur are types of joints that can move freely. And those are also known as synovial joints. And they're called synovial because the lining of the cartilage has synovial cells which secrete synovial fluid. Secrete happens inside the body, excrete happens from the inside to the outside of the body, right? So they secrete synovial fluid, and synovial fluid helps to cushion and lubricate the joint. And if we look at synarthrodial as immovable, amphiarthrodial as partially movable, and diarthrodial as freely movable, then we get an additional classification, which is by, I would say by the shape. I don't know what that terminology is called, but I would say the shape. So it's like, is it a suture or a primary or secondary? Is it a plane hinge? These are all shapes, right? Plane, hinge, pivot, condylar. Primary and secondary are also shapes, although they are they're less obvious names of shapes. Secondary is also called a symphysis type joint, symphysis, and then primary is called syndesmotic, and that may or may not be familiar to you as a type of joint shape. And then sutures, gomphosis, and syndesmosis, these all can be like confusing sounding, but they're really just referring to the way that the joint looks. Like a suture looks like a line that has been stitched with stitching across it. Those are the joints of the skull, for example. And we'll be looking at each of these tonight. Let me see if there's any other. Yeah, okay. All right, so just to review before we start getting into the details, synarthrotic has fibrous connective tissue joining two bones, and there's no movement between them. They're also called fibrous. synarthrotic are also called fibrous. And amphiarthrosis are also called cartilaginous or slightly movable, cartilaginous or slightly movable. Diarthrotic, diarthrosis joints are also called synovial joints or freely movable. So you will hear fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. That's the same as synarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, diarthrotic, respectively. Okay, so sutures. Sutures are immovable. Coronal suture is the example that they list. So when you hear coronal, think crown, corona, think head, right? So the sutures in the skull are immovable. That's a fibrous or a synarthrotic joint. If you guys want to see any of these drawings, diagrams, anatomical pictures, you just let me know, okay? Otherwise, I'm going to go through them didactically, which means just verbally. Gomphosis, for example, dentoalveolar joint. So a gomphosis is examples of gomphosis joints are the teeth as they fit into the mandible or the maxilla. And those are held in there by tendons. And then, yeah, teeth between the teeth and the mandible. And then the joint found between the first pair of ribs and the sternum. So rib 1, R1, and the sternum, which I think actually attaches to the manubrium. So there's the manubrium, then there's the sternum, and then there's the xiphoid. Is that correct? Is the middle piece called the sternum?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I always forget if that's the whole thing or the one piece. So those are synarthrotic joints. Those are the synarthrotic joints. Where's the gomphoses refer specifically to the dentures or the teeth. Syndesmotic joints or syndesmoses are, for example, the interosseous membrane of the forearm and the leg. So I found a couple like different sources that say have different opinions. So some sources say that those are the syndesmotic joints are amphiarthrosis, and some say the syndesmotic joints are synarthrosis. So my opinion is that they are amphiarthrotic because unlike synarthrotic joints, those structures allow for slight movement. So if you were to take your forearm, let me know if you cannot see me. If you were to take your forearm and touch the ulna and the radius, something like that, or do it on the other side, however you want to, and you were to rotate, what you would feel is that right at the extreme of supination, there feels like there's a little kind of like play in the joints between the ulna and the radius, right? There's free movement of the radius around the ulna, and then the movement kind of stops at the radius. And if you force it a little bit, you can feel like a stretch in between these two bones here, right? So that joint, this is considered a joint between the radius and the ulna, and it's joined by fibrous connective tissue called the interosseous membrane that's between these two bones. And the same thing happens between the tibia and the fibula. So those membranes, those fibrous connective tissue connections allow for slight movement, but not a lot of movement. Their purpose is to be as supportive as to have the same kind of high integrity in structure as like the synarthrotic joints of the ribs, the synarthrotic joints of the sutures in the head, of the dentures, but to provide some movement. So I think probably so that there's like some shock absorption in the lower body. Let's look at the interosseous membranes just for a second. And of the information that you're preparing, this is like the lowest probability that you'll be asked. But if someone asks you, obviously you will need to know it. So between the tibia and the fibula, as well as between the radius and the ulna, there's this fibrous tendinous structure. And you can imagine that it would allow the fibula and the tibia, it would allow the fibula to move a little bit up and down, and even in and out. So if you were to grab your wrist, so you're grabbing your ulna and your radius, if you were to squeeze them, you should be able to feel there's a little bit of give between those bones, right? And that's a result of an amphiarthrotic, in my opinion, amphiarthrotic joint nature. Okay, it's really challenging for me to give you guys like complete information that provide you with some context of all this stuff: anatomy, physiology, kinesiology, patho, without giving you too much and without giving you information that you're not going to need. It's superfluous. Okay, so okay, and then for the cartilaginous joints, think. Let's go over these symphysis joints first. Symphysis. So symphysis joints are areas where there's thick cartilage. So that's the pubic symphysis, and then the joints between the vertebrae. So the intervertebral discs. Does everyone know what the pubic symphysis looks like? Yes, no?
No.
Not really. Okay. So if you look at the pubic symphysis, what you see right away is, well, and when they show the cartilage, what you see right away is that there is a thick piece of cartilage between the bones, right? And this piece of cartilage allows these two halves of the pelvis to actually rotate a little bit in opposite directions. And in childbirth, because of the hormone relaxin, which softens all the connective tissue in the body so that the joints can open, this pubic symphysis cartilage can actually stretch a little bit so that the left and the right aspects of the pelvis can drift away from each other, and that the birth, not the birth canal, I forget what this space is called, so that this space can open and the infant's head can pass, and then the whole body can pass through that space more easily. And then if you look at the intervertebral joints, if you look at the vertebrae, I mean, you guys have seen this 100 times, that with the vertebrae, there are discs between, and we think of them sometimes as like jelly donuts, like things that have lots of fluid inside, which they do, but they're very, very tough. They have a very, very tough exterior made out of connective tissue, and over time they become compressed, and then their integrity starts to break down. But they start out life as fibrous connective tissue with fluid on the inside. Okay. So those are symphysis joints, and if you go down a little bit further into the notes, you see under amphiarthrosis, you see symphysis joints, and then where is it listed down here? I don't see it down here, but that's okay. All right, symphysis joints. So that's the pubic symphysis and the intervertebral joints. Discs. Hopefully you guys know that it's intervertebral joints, intervertebral discs. All right, and then the syndesmotic joints, right, which we just covered a minute ago. Okay, the diarthrosis or diarthrotic joints. These guys are the joints that we think of as the joints proper. These are the ones that allow the most movement in the body. These are synovial joints, so they have cells in the cartilage that secrete synovial fluid. So diarthrotic is the same as synovial, which is the same as freely movable. So if you guys can get those synonyms, those also known as, if you can get those down, it'll save you a lot of grief on the exam. Hopefully they ask you like several questions based on this stuff, because if you get some of the information in your mind, you can reproduce it from a couple different angles. So hopefully they'll ask you like, a dozen questions about these. May you be asked a dozen questions about the joints. So the synovial joints or the diarthrotic joints, they're the plane, hinge, pivot, condylar, saddle, and ball and socket. And in your March 2023 basics, there's a link here that you can click, and it will open this chart. So let's go over the types now. So that is there a question? So this is the pivot joint, and the pivot joint is found. It's for sure found in one place of the body, and that's C1 and C2, which are actually be up here against the skull. C1 and C2, and they allow a turning around one axis. So this is one axis here, and in the elbow, this is one axis. See, the turning is happening around this axis, right? And then in like a ball and socket joint, this is one axis here. See, this turning is happening around this axis. And this is a second axis here. See, this turning is happening around this axis. And you could even say that there's one going this way, right? Which would be abduction, abduction. Oh, this is really clear. So this is one axis and then a second axis. Okay. So pivot joints. So pivot joints are found, one of them between the atlas and the axis. I did see this on one of the practice questions, and I didn't know this before the practice question. I'm in my field what's called a bonehead. So I was surprised that I didn't know this. But the atlas and the axis, they're the top two bones of the spine. They interact with the skull. They interact with each other. The top bone, the atlas, just like the Titan who was cursed to hold up the earth, or maybe he was cursed to hold up the sky. I don't remember. Anyway, so Atlas is the top bone, C1, which holds up the skull, and then the axis, C2, below it provides an axis. It provides a way for the atlas and the skull to turn. Think of the atlas and the skull as like one piece functionally. The skull moves and the atlas always moves with it. And the atlas and the skull turn around the axis. So that is pivot joint. Another pivot joint takes place in the elbow, the proximal part of the elbow. Remember, proximal and distal. Hopefully all you guys can see me. I don't have my camera on tonight, my like review camera, so I can see. But the radius joint fits into this annular ligament up here and allows the radius to spin, allows the radius to turn. And it turns, here it turns like this, inside the annular ligament. And then at the other end, the radius is going like this in an arc, right? So that's another pivot joint. Before we go over the other types of joints, I just want to show you guys this video, which I know it may seem, hopefully it doesn't seem like kind of lame to you that I'm like giving you other people's videos to watch. I really do think it's helpful to get more than like one perspective. Let's put this, I guess I'll just put it down here. So if you go to classifications of joints, this is that thing that I sent you guys earlier today. I just thought that it was a really like exact, thorough, effective summary of the different kinds of joints. Notice they use the term fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. And Stephanie, what kind of joint is a synovial joint? Is that diarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, or synarthrotic? Synovial joints secrete synovial fluid. So that implies what? More movement or less movement?
More movement.
So would that be di, syn, or amphi?
Die.
Correct. Cartilaginous joints, Dora, no one will be spared. What do you think? Amphi or synarthrotic?
Synarthrotic, I believe.
Okay, so fibrous is connective tissue fiber joining two bones with likely no cartilage in between. And then cartilaginous would be connective tissue joining two bones with some cartilage in between. So do you think, which one do you think would have more movement, fibrous or cartilaginous?
Fibrous.
Okay, so it's actually the other way around.
Oh.
So fibrous has little to no movement. So that's syndesmotic. Synarthrotic, not syndesmotic, synarthrotic. Syndesmosis is a type of fibrous joint. And then cartilaginous would be somewhat movable. Okay, so that's that reference, which I thought was good. And here's a video which you should watch. Okay, let's go to the first chapter. Synovial joints. There's 6 types of synovial joints. That's like the plane joint, the ball and socket, the hinge joint, right? All those. And then, oh, here we go. So this is the one, this is the pivot joint I was talking about. So the pivot joint and rotation along one axis. This is the axis right there. See, I like how they draw it. It makes it really clear. You want to quickly get what an axis is. So here's the radius and here's the ulna. Here's the radius and the ulna. And right here, there's going to be a ligament. There's a ligament, annular ligament. And the radius turns inside of it. You see how the bone doesn't move medially or laterally. It turns around this axis, right? Down here, it moves medially and laterally. So yeah, see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. And the rest of this video is like really useful. It's a very like quick, effective way to understand, oh, there's flexion, there's abduction, adduction, and then there's rotation around an axis and circumduction. So that must be like a ball and socket type joint. Okay, so now let's take a look at the hinge joints. So we find hinge joints in the elbow and in the knee. The hinge joints are the ones, oh, and in the ankle, between the tibia and the talus. The hinge joints are the ones mainly where we need to do flexion and extension. So elbow flexion and extension, right? Knee flexion and extension, and then dorsiflexion and plantar flexion at the ankle. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion at the ankle. There's like many types of joints in the ankle and foot, and the foot is made up of ankle and foot are made up of hind foot, the midfoot, and the forefoot. So there are more than one type of joint down there, but when we speak of the ankle, for the most part, we're talking about a hinge joint that allows for plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Hinge joint. One thing I like about this video that they show in, for example, the hinge joint is that the hinge joint prevents certain kinds of movements. Yeah, so the hinge joint prevents.
It allows movement only on one axis. Its structure prevents rotation this way or this way.
See that?
The head of the...
It's kind of cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
Its structure prevents rotation this way or this way.
Yeah, so they cannot rotate around a central axis. It also cannot abduct or adduct. And then I'm going to let him explain saddle joints, which are of the most confusing. Let's just do that now.
The saddle joint. The saddle joint is similar to the ellipsoid, but the rotation is limited mostly because of the bone structure. The structure of the saddle is very interesting. Both bones have a concave and convex surface. Convex means the surface sticks out like a hill.
That might be that's a question, practice question I've seen in the AMTA. Which bone has both concave and convex surfaces?
Concave means the surface curves in, like a hole, or cave. The concave plane of one fits on the convex plane of the other.
Concave plane of one. So this is concave on the lower bone right here. That's a cave. And this is a vex, convex on the upper bone. And this is concave on the upper bone and convex on the lower bone. Is that unclear to anybody?
No.
Okay.
It's like a 3D yin-yang, or a cowboy on a horse. The saddle makes the bottom piece, and the cowboy's legs make the top piece. The legs of the top piece, which wrap around the body of the bottom piece, allow a rotation this way. The body of the top piece can glide inside the legs of the bottom piece. So this unique structure allows the joint to flex, extend, abduct, adduct, circumduct, and very slightly rotate.
That's the thumb
An example
joint.
of the saddle joint on the body is the carpometacarpal joint of the thumb. Let's see that baby in action.
Sigh. Yeah, so anyway. So they will ask you stuff like that. Which bone has both convex and concave aspects on its surface or on its articulating surface? And the answer would be the saddle joint. Okay, let's keep looking at, let's keep going with these. So we did a hinge, we did saddle. Let's move on to condyloid, which is also an ellipsoidal condyloid or ellipsoidal joint. So of the types of joints remaining, we have a few which are ball and socket, right? So the proper ball and socket is the hip joint, which is a deep socket the ball fits into. And then the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint, is a shallow socket with a big ball on top. So the glenohumeral is kind of like a scoop of ice cream, like a big scoop of ice cream on top of a ice cream cone. And this would be kind of like a stingy scoop of ice cream on a big ice cream cone, you know, like those big waffle cones that you get at the like bougie places like Cold Stone. They have these big funnel containers. I never understood what the purpose of those is. They're so big you have to eat the scoop with a spoon. So anyway, the ellipsoidal joint is also a ball and socket, but it's really shallow. It's really shallow. And the ellipsoidal joint can be found between the radius ulna and the carpals, so in the wrist, as well as the base of the index finger. So that's the metacarpal phalangeal joint, the carpals of the wrist, and in the elbow and the wrist joint. So if we look at the wrist joint, you can see that overall there's a very shallow ball and socket or an ellipse shape. So if we consider the ulna and the radius to be one bone, this is like a socket, like an elliptoid shaped socket. And this is like these bones, these carpals all together are like a ball, an ellipse shaped ball. So a ball is round, like a sphere. An ellipse is more oblong, like an oval, right? So these are shaped like an oval on top, and this is shaped like an oval shaped socket, ellipse shaped socket. Ellipse or condyloid. I'll see the word condyloid used predominantly. So when you see condyloid, you have to think about the shape of the joint. You have to think about where it is and the shape of the joint. Also, the base of the index finger. So if we look at here's the thumb, here's the index, middle, ring, and pinky. And if you look at the base of the index finger, there's also an ellipsoid joint here, right? But if I'm not mistaken, the joints of the fingers, like all the joints of the fingers themselves, are all ellipsoidal joints. See? Doesn't that look like an ellipse?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this would be the base, like this would be like what we think of as the knuckles, the striking part. And then I think these would be ellipsoids, but I'm not sure. But yeah, okay. So ellipsoid, that's when it says two axes that permit up and down and side to side motions for the wrist, what they mean is it allows flexion and extension, and it allows ulnar and radial deviation, If it were a saddle joint, for example, or a deeper ball and socket, it also would allow for like a sliding action, not a ball and socket. If it were a saddle joint, it would allow for like a sliding action. This socket also allows for circumduction. I don't know why that's not listed here, but I mean, I'm circumducting right now, so clearly it does that. All right, gliding joints. This one was a little confusing for me at first, but you just have to remember that the vertebrae are gliding joints. Also, there's the joint between the forearm and the wrist. So the joint we just looked at, which is ellipsoid, is considered to have gliding movement properties. And the ankle joint, which we looked at earlier and said was a hinge joint, is also considered to be a gliding joint. So joints can be more than one type, especially if it's like a shallow ellipsoid type joint. It could be shallow enough to operate as a plane, or if the plane has a little bit of a curve on it, then it could be curved enough to be an ellipsoid. And these are interesting. I doubt you'll be tested on this, but basically all the joints between the ribs and the vertebrae. So where the ribs join the spine, where the ribs join the backbone, those are all gliding joints. So gliding joints allow for quite a lot of movement. They allow for a lot of movement, and they allow for movement in a unique way. So if I take my hand, can everybody see my hand and wrist?
Yes.
If I take my hand and I do what's called translation, you can see that I can actually translate it forward and back against the wrist, against the forearm bones, and I can translate it left and right a little bit. And you can do this with your own. Just go straight left and right, and go anterior, go like dorsal and volar, and you can feel there's some play in there. That's called the drawer test in some parts of the body. Like in the knee, they call that the drawer test. And then the joints of the vertebrae, the joints between the vertebrae, also because the vertebrae are flat, like checkers, or like hockey pucks or discs, those joints allow the vertebrae great amount of movement. They actually can move forward a little bit. Sometimes we see them move forward and get stuck in people who hyperextend their spine a lot. Cheerleading, powerlifting, and gymnastics. And I also see it in dancers, ballet dancers. Sometimes it'll move forward a little bit. And then it can move forward and back, side to side, and it can twist. So the plane joint or the gliding joint actually allows for quite a lot of movement, two or more round or flat bones to move freely together, gliding in any direction, right? So that's interesting because that means that the ribs where they meet the spine have a lot more movement back there than we think. Like ribs can come out of place back there all the time, the same way that you get a bone in your wrist out of place and you traction your wrist, or you traction your fingers, or you move and it clicks and goes back into place. Same thing happens with the ribs in the back, except they don't go back into place quite so easily because of where they're located. So by virtue of the pressure and the traction on tissues that we do back there using our hands, we can actually put those bones back in place after relieving spasm and loosening things up, flushing fluids out and decreasing pressure in the area if they're swelling. Those rib heads can actually move back into place. Bodywork is cool. Okay, so let me just drill you guys a little bit. Oh, ball and socket, I think I mentioned. Ball and socket allows movement in all directions. and it's the hip and the shoulder. So Vincent,
Yes.
which joint is deeper and which joint is more shallow? The shoulder joint or the hip joint?
The hip joint is deeper and the shoulders is shallower.
That's right. And what's the difference between the ellipsoid type joint and the ball and socket type joint?
One looks like an ice cream cone. The other one looks like a, well, they both look like ice cream cones. One looks like a scoop, a smaller scoop, and the other one's a bigger scoop.
That's the difference between the hip joint, which is the smaller scoop and the bigger cone, and the shoulder joint, which is the bigger scoop in the smaller cone.
Okay.
And an ellipsoid joint is less like a ball and more like a pancake or a football or an ellipse.
Oval. Okay.
An oval, yeah. An oval, yeah. Stephanie.
Yeah.
Name the two pivot joints in the body.
The two pivot joints
Uh-huh.
and the
They
elbow.
They allow rotation around our axis. Yeah, which part of the elbow? The ulna or the radius?
The ulna.
Pivot.
No, the radius.
The radius, there you go. And what kind of joint is the ulna? Allows only for flexion and extension, like a door opening and closing.
Saddle.
No saddle, the only saddle joint's in the thumb.
Hmm.
Yeah, that is a hinge joint.
A hinge joint.
Yeah, where's the other pivot joint? It's in the neck, where the neck meets the skull. What's that joint called?
Oh yeah, the pivot joint. One thing rotation. The
Name-
axis.
Yes, the full name, please.
Atlanto-occipital joint.
There you go. Atlanto-axial. Oh, I put Atlanto-occipital. It's not Atlanto-occipital.
Atlanto.
This is like nerd freak out time. Atlanto-axial. Yeah, Atlanto-axial pivot joint, not Atlanto-occipital. No.
Some studying to do.
What's that?
I say I've got some studying to do.
Yeah, join the club. You and me both, apparently. Okay.
And me.
We're not forgetting about you. Dora. So hinge joints. So you just heard us say that the elbow is a hinge joint.
Mhm.
Can you name the two other hinge joints in the body? So these are joints that only allow for movement in one plane, flexion and then extension. That's considered one movement.
Oh, and like the knee,
The knee, very good.
and the ankle, I believe.
The ankle, yes. And the ankle is also considered not to do another kind of movement.
Gliding.
Gliding, that's right, gliding joints. Where are the other gliding joints in the body?
I guess your wrist might be.
The wrist may be a gliding joint. Yeah, can be considered to be a gliding type joint. But there's two other areas which are definitely gliding joints, which you're probably going to be tested on.
I'm not sure.
Okay, it's the bones in the body which have flat surfaces that contact each other. In this case, they're shaped. They
Like
have
the
a round.
pelvis.
Higher than the pelvis. Higher than the pelvis. I know the joint you're thinking of. That's not bad thinking, but I think those are amphiarthrotic joints.
Oh,
And the gliding joint is a diarthrotic joint. So gliding joints are found between the bones that are shaped like discs.
oh, okay. I see. It's the our back. What is it? The
Yeah, take your time.
Our spinal cord, our spine.
Not the spinal cord,
Yes, just
the
I'm
spine.
sorry, it's like at the tip of my tongue, but I can't think.
Yes, I know. Yes, your brain literally is sorting through all the information and like trying to sort it, and it's organizing it more clearly right now. So congratulations. We are watching you learn. It's awesome. Truly. And tonight, when you go to sleep, as long as you get enough sleep, your brain is going to actually do this sorting and associating tonight. And tomorrow you'll know it more exactly. And if you wake up tomorrow and you look at like gliding joints, first thing when you wake up, it'll be really powerful.
I find it like these words that we talk about I find myself like thinking about them throughout the days or day or night.
Yes. Welcome to the profession. Excellent. And then remember, it's just interesting that the ribs where they attach to the vertebrae are also gliding joints. Okay, and then the condyloid joints, where do we find those? Vincent?
The wrist, the elbow.
Yes, the wrist is the elbow. Yeah, I guess the elbow is, but they definitely would ask you about the wrist. And then something like the base of the index finger. Okay, I'm going to clarify. This is the thing that drives me crazy is like, how much detail do I give you guys? Do I need to clarify every single the joint structure of every single finger? Yeah, maybe. Okay, let's take a break. So let's go over some pathology questions.